All right, and we're live.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is session 3 of the EQ Deficiency book tour. My name is Blair, and I'm going to kind of be your guide for our chat today. And I'm going to introduce both Brittney and Josh today. And then I'll step back and try to let the two of them have a dialogue around today's topic and today's conversation, what I would probably describe as a little bit of a deeper dive into emotional intelligence between the two of them. And then we'll finish up and leave some time at the end for questions, should you have any. We'll go from there. So real quick, my name is, again, Blair Primis. I work for an organization here in Charlotte, North Carolina called OrthoCarolina, and it's a multi-specialty orthopedics practice. And I serve in a function of communications and marketing, and we have a culture team here and human resources. And one of the things that I was fascinated by after meeting Brittney and reading her book is how a lot of the principles and ideas in her book could be applied to the disciplines that we have inside our organization. And so my area, my teams are responsible for both the external and the internal communications of our company. And how can we learn some of those tips and tricks and tools so that they can be pervasive across our teams? They can become part of our culture, not just something that we deploy when we feel like it's necessary. How do we bake it in? And so just knowing Brittney for the time I have and thumbing through a lot of the chapters in the book that she's written, I wanted to play a role. And so here I am today as your moderator for what normally would have been I'm sure, right? You'd be in a bookstore somewhere signing copies. But in today's day and age, today's day and age, we're going to do it here today. So I'm going to let Brittney go ahead and introduce herself and maybe just tell us real quick, Brittney, why write the book? Why'd you do it? What drove you to capture these thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Blair.
Yep.
So again, I share a little bit of a different reason for writing the book each session, right?
Yeah.
And so today I'm going to share just seeing and observing the world around us and what we oftentimes pin the blame on as that's a bad person, or they're just miserable, or, this world is just such a terrible place and it's evil. And it's really not. It's just we are emotional creatures. And we were never taught the skill set of harnessing the power of our emotions and understanding our emotions. And so these toxic behaviors, if you will, that we're seeing in our society today is just a reflection of our lack of emotional intelligence. I feel for the vast majority of these situations. So the reason I wrote the book was to really bring to light that this person isn't a bad person. This situation could have been prevented, and providing real life, real case scenarios of these types of events and explaining how emotional intelligence plays into that and how we can apply that in our lives to prevent these emotions from presenting themselves in an unpleasant or toxic way, because all emotions are is data. And emotions are not bad. It's the lack of being able to control them effectively that can tailspin into something that is toxic and unpleasant. So that is kind of the purpose, or one of the reasons for writing this book.
Okay, that's awesome, and that makes so much sense, especially today in the time we're in. And maybe there's no better intro for Josh than what you just described around the data component of it, because from a little bit of the research I've done on him, I really appreciate how you break down this idea that emotional intelligence are data points that we can use to then deploy so that we can modify our behaviors. So Josh Freedman, take it away. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background? So accomplished, you've done so much. Before we got live, we were chatting about all the great places and people that you've been talking to virtually across the world. So please, a little bit of a background for you and for the group listening and for people tuning in today.
Well, I got interested in emotional intelligence when I was a teacher, which feels like a very long time ago.
And
in 1992, I met Daniel Goleman when he came and he visited the school where I was teaching. And he saw the process we did there for supporting kids to understand their own emotions and the way they could make better choices. Awesome. He said, hey, you know what you guys are doing is teaching emotional intelligence. And it really speaks to what Brittney-Nichole was just talking about. I don't think it's so useful, whether we're talking about kids or adults, to say, you should do this or you should do that. If we can have better skills for making decisions and for understanding how do we assess where we are and how do we understand the implications of the different options that we have, and then have the wherewithal to actually step forward in a way that's aligned with our goals. So that's what I learned back then. In 1995, Dan's book came out and became an international bestseller, and he'd written about self-science, which was our process, science of studying yourself.
Yeah.
And in 1997, we started 6 Seconds to help people understand how you actually put emotional intelligence into action. Not what it is, but how. And now we work in over 200 countries. We work with huge businesses and tiny little organizations and schools and government agencies. And all of that is around integrating the science of emotional intelligence into a way that's practical, into a way that people can bring that in, as Brittney-Nichole said, and I think you said too, Blair, into our daily lives, not as like, oh, I'm going to go, use my emotional intelligence.
It's time to pull out my emotional intelligence wand. Yeah, right.
It's really about daily life. And we talk about the idea of practicing. And, our vision is 1 billion people practicing emotional intelligence.
Wow, awesome.
That practice, we can talk more about later, but it's really easy. It's not a complex theory. Super practical. But what's hard is to do it consistently.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Just to riff off that a bit, when you think about it, it's not black and white. It's a nuanced and gray space, which I think sometimes presents to people as more complex, because it isn't like it's right or wrong, or it's left, or right. Well, depending on how you're looking at me on the screen, maybe this is your left, this is your right. But because it's intentionally nuanced, it might present itself as perhaps a more cerebral exercise for folks. So tell me, that's really interesting as an idea. So tell me a little bit more about that. So how do you see that might be an obstacle? Again, I'm riffing here a bit. Is that an obstacle? Sometimes they come into this and say, whoa, emotional intelligence, that seems big to me. How would I implement that? How can I be a catalyst for change in my organization? Does it come across sometimes as a big task for people when really it may not be?
Well, I think that there's a group of people for whom this sounds touchy-feely. Immediately you say emotional intelligence. And I remember working with the US Navy and Marine Corps and Coast Guard, and we did a pilot program for a couple of days with a bunch of senior officers, and then we were debriefing. And unbeknownst to me, they were vetting this to see if it was something they wanted to roll out. And thankfully, they chose to do that, and we worked with them for 18 months. But at the end, one of the officers said, this is really good stuff, but could we call it something else? Because this word emotional, I don't know how people are going to react to
respond to it.
It's like, oh, we're going to get emotional about the word emotional,
right.
Rational here. So I think part of it is just acknowledging that humans we are rational, but we're not just rational. And so figuring out how to make this stuff make sense. And I find particularly in larger organizations, there's such a strong predilection for quantitative decision-making.
Right.
So, how do we make a graph of this? And, we measure trust. We measure the competencies of emotional intelligence. We can correlate emotional intelligence with employee engagement, with performance. We've done that with factories. We've done that with the military organizations, we've been really making this stuff something where you could say, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
And then also for those for whom the quantitative issue isn't really the issue, making it tangible.
Right.
And so we do a lot of things with, I see over my shoulder a jar of pickup sticks, it's just right, to make this stuff tangible,
right.
Where we can help people literally put these ideas in their hands and move them around on the table and talk about it as something real.
Yeah.
That seems to be, those two things seem to be really key for implementation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I work, as I mentioned, in a physician practice, and it's funny because being in a more creative role inside a, what I would call more data-driven organization, the data says this is how you do a knee replacement. The data says this is how you fix someone's finger. The data says this is how you. It's always very challenging to say, to your point, well, let's dive into our emotions here and think of how we can be better as an organization. To your point, oftentimes there's an instant recoil, when the reality is they very much are governed by those feelings, and thus it creates their behavior in a way that, especially for our organization, they're the owners of our organization. I would love for them to embrace a little bit more of that openness around it. And I like the way you put that. It keeps it, the need is tangible, right? We've got to be able to showcase and touch something, come away with something at the end of the day. So let me ask you this. What do you think in your life prior to the early 90s? Was there any sort of, how you grew up, or any sort of life experiences you had that you think informed the direction your career would take over the last few decades? Anything there that you think that folks listening, or folks that have young kids, or to your point about being an educator, tell me a little bit about where you may have been where did the desire for this come from?
Well, I was a poster child for not being prepared for this.
There you go.
I told Brittney-Nichole before, I grew up being afraid of emotions.
Really?
My parents were both statisticians. The joke about the difference between an introverted statistician and an extroverted statistician?
No.
An extroverted statistician looks at your shoes when they're talking to you.
That's fantastic.
So, my own experience was I didn't like to ask people how they were feeling, because, God forbid they might tell me. And then, what if they cried, or what if they were mad at me, and I think there are probably a lot of people who experience this. I had this sense that it was going to be like Pandora's box. And if I was in a meeting and I could look around in the meeting and see somebody was upset, like, oh, I better not, I hope they don't talk, because, we're going to get into this thing and then it's just going to get out of control. So I was a reluctant student of emotional intelligence.
Right. Fascinating.
And that's part of why I think I take such a data-oriented approach to this, and really trying to understand kind of an IQ approach to EQ.
EQ, right.
But, I feel for those physicians who are like, I've been trained, I know the procedures.
Yeah.
Why aren't people just more rational? I tell my patients what to do, and I know, why don't they just do it?
Right.
And by the way, I've said that as a manager sometimes.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But this, if we really want to be rational, we have to confront the reality that we're not just rational.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah.
I don't know how many times either of you have been in a meeting with somebody who's like, "Can we just be rational about this?"
Yes, let's break down.
Like,
right. Exactly.
Yes, let's do that.
Yes. Given how emotional you just got, asking us to be rational, that should tell us something, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
As opposed to more of a serene, calm conversation is saying, if we could introduce some rational thinking here, right? That's almost never the case. So Brittney, what are your thoughts there? How do you think some of those ideas around, that may play in some of the chapters of the book? What are some of the areas you think where you might be able to suss that out for those that pick up a copy and want to learn a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I should probably went through the book before we got on this call, because there's it's kind of like woven in the fabric of the book, right? It's like little pockets of that information everywhere. But, I talk about the mechanics of the mind and the biology behind emotional intelligence, because I think when, like Josh was saying, we think about let's be rational. In order to be rational, we have to be in control of our emotions, because that's just the way the mind operates. It's kind of a tier level of our brain, right? We have our autonomic nervous system, which makes things function without thinking about it, so our subconscious. And then it goes to the emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, right? And then it goes to the frontal cortex, where we think and we rationalize and we process information. Mm-hmm. But whenever we're in that emotional state and we don't have control over it, it hinders our rational processing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if people want us to be rational, then they have to be emotional first, at least in control of those emotions. And I think that's where emotions get a bad name, is because when people think of, well, you're emotional, they think of the lack of control people have over their emotions.
Right.
But when they have control over their emotions, they don't see that as being emotional.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So I talk about that, and all of the chemicals in the body and in the brain, like our neurotransmitters. When we have a thought, it creates this chemical soup, if you will, in our brain with all these neurotransmitters. Well, those neurotransmitters affect us at a very cellular level. And if we can control our thoughts and how we react and respond, then we control those chemicals. Yeah. Which means we can control so many other things in our life, like stress and our chances of getting coronary heart disease and all of these other things. So I think if you can sum it up that way to people that are like, I'm not into this whole emotional thing, and show them the data and the science and the biology behind it, then they would see it completely differently than they do now.
Even in the workplace, if you think, oh yeah, let's have people leave emotions out, and you could, whether this is in a medical practice or anywhere else, like, okay, so do we want to leave out trust? Do we want to leave out curiosity?
Very true. Yeah.
Do we want to leave out passion? Do we want to leave out caring for each other?
Right.
Do we want to leave out innovation? Do we want to leave out loyalty? Like, all of those things are driven by emotion.
Very true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think we want to actually, even the most kind of diehard, let's be rational person, when it comes to, like, well, in our customer relationships and our employee relationships, we don't actually want to leave it out.
Right. I mean, it's almost like trying to strip yourself of empathy in some way too. What a seemingly bad choice that might be oftentimes when dealing with people, right, is to have zero empathy. And maybe on the flip side of that too is to be curious about why people are feeling. I mean, I love you brought that in. I've always thought in this space too that folks that are in touch with or you behave a certain way because you're smart about your feelings. And if you can do that, then it means you're naturally curious why others are behaving that way. And that's a whole different way to approach a conversation, a meeting, an interaction of some kind, very curious. I like the idea of being curious around things. I'd love your guys' thoughts on why being curious is such an advantage, right, for organizations, for teams. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on curiosity and what kind of role that may play. I'm intrigued by that.
Well, I think one thing we have to confront is the complexity of our work and our world. And, if basically what we want to do is have people execute a task with no change, with no energy, with no just like kind of robotically do this thing and the same thing every day, then curiosity and other emotions might not actually be that useful. But when we're dealing with a situation of a lot of change and complexity, and Brittney-Nichole, you were talking about just the way people are behaving. I think we have to acknowledge that we're in a context, and it's a tremendously complex and difficult context. Our kids are coming up in this environment, which is very different than when we grew up. And we're not, even if we wanted to, and I know some people do want to, but even if we want to, there is no going back. And so let's deal with the reality that we have right now. And just for example, I'm in Silicon Valley, and once upon a time in Silicon Valley, a rock star coder was the make or break for a company. And so you'd have, Google and Microsoft like fighting over a person. Double your salary, and it's like, and now what is happening in this industry, like in most industries, is this growing realization that actually the ability to work together and to work across boundaries and to influence people and engage and understand people from different perspectives is way more valuable. Because the problems are way more complex.
Right.
So you think about like literally a piece of code. If the piece of code is, this big, one person can know the whole thing and write it and make it better. And then, the code becomes
massive,
big, and it's like no one can handle it.
Right.
And so how do we work with people from different perspectives and understand the problem? Whether that problem is delivering great healthcare or whether that problem is helping, our kids flourish in a very inhospitable social context that they're in, or whether it's, returning civil discourse to the political sphere, like that would be, or, dealing with huge challenges. I've got somewhere here on the table, the Sustainable Development Goals, like, how do we deal with this stuff? Poverty, and, health for everyone, and food, and sustainable cities, and these problems are tremendously complex.
Right.
And to curiosity, to come back to your question, nobody has the answer to these complex problems. So how are we going to solve them?
Yeah.
And when I think of curiosity and kind of leading into that, or piggybacking off of that, I think of communication and how a lot of people in organizations talk about effective communication, which is so key. But in order to be an effective communicator, you have to have emotional intelligence to make sure that you are not misinterpreting, to make sure your emotions are not leading you to hear something or allow your biases to get in the way of that communication. So when I think of curiosity, that's what I think of as communication. And then piggybacking off what you said with all of these things that need us to collaborate with one another, we have to be curious, but that also means we have to be effective communicators and also realize that things are not right or wrong, black or white. Like you were saying earlier, Blair, we live in this gray world. And so to solve these problems, there could be a number of ways to solve them. But if we're so focused on being the one who solves them, or so focused on telling someone else why theirs isn't the right way of handling that situation, then we'll never solve them. And I feel like that's where we are now, is instead of trying to truly solve the problem, we're so focused on telling others why they can't solve the problem, how we can solve the problem, why they're wrong and why we're right. And we're never going to get anywhere with that. And I think that's another reason why emotional intelligence is so important.
Fascinating.
So the neuroscience of this is very intriguing, which is that we get a dopamine reward for being certain. And our brains equate uncertainty and danger.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Our brains really don't like uncertainty.
Right.
And so when we have this context, and I think we're facing tremendous uncertainty in the world right now.
Yeah.
In that context, our brains are going, what? I want to be certain. What can I hold on to? What can I control?
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to a kind of righteousness where we're like, I don't know how to fix any of this, but you're wrong, and you're wrong, and you're wrong.
Yeah.
And it feels good. It feels good to be
because of the chemical release there. Right.
Yeah.
It's
literally, dopamine is heroin. We literally are addicted to this reward system that we get. Now, what's interesting is we have a secondary dopamine reward system for learning. And so if you imagine our great ancestors, are walking down the forest path. We want them to say, oh, let me go over here and explore. And so they get a dopamine reward for that. When there's like rustling in the bushes and there's, growling noises, don't go explore right now.
Right, stay away. Right.
Stay on the path.
Stay on the path, yeah.
So the more stressed we are and the more volatile the environment, the more pressure we have from this very deep neurological system, the more pressure we have to stay with the conformity. And yet it's that's not working.
Right. That's what we have to challenge, right?
Right. Yeah.
Fascinating.
So I think, just going back to Brittney-Nichole's point, it's like, yes, this is how our brains and bodies work. This is how we're wired. Now what?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Are we gonna operate as if it's, 7,000 BC, or are we gonna operate in the reality that we're in?
Yeah, modern times.
And another, sorry, Blair. I just want to jump in there for a second because, Josh, as you know, when we're in that state of self-preservation mode, which we're in more and more these days with all the modern day stressors in life, it's hard to get out of that self-preservation mode and go into rational thinking. So it becomes this paradox of how do we become informed and how do we escape this fear that is holding us back from, moving forward and evolving ourselves emotionally, especially when approximately 90% of the population lacks the skill set for handling their emotions. That's something hard to escape.
Or even acknowledging that the emotions are present.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. So what do you think about, is it a leadership opportunity? Do we need leaders to become more self-aware, right? As they move up a corporate chain, as they lead a platoon, right, Josh, in your Navy example, as they lead a squad, do they need to almost be less they learned a skill and they got promoted, and then they are in charge of 3 people that knew that skill, and then all of a sudden they do that again, they get promoted again. Now they're in charge of 5 people that knew that skill, but nobody told them how to manage 5 people. They just know that they're like a mega version of what they started as. Yeah. And so how does that switch now realizing I have to be self-aware that I may have, Brittney heard me say this before, my philosophy on this is that it's a game of chess, not checkers. And the pieces all move in different directions and at different speeds and at different angles. And you have to be conscious of that. So is it a leadership opportunity? I mean, emotional intelligence to serve leaders better, right?
I have a friend named Joy Palmer who wrote a book called Player to Coach. And she talks exactly about this, that, when we are in an operational frontline role, whether that's as a physician or whether that's, cooking in a kitchen or whether that's teaching, doesn't, whatever, we are trained and hired and promoted because we're good at those tasks. And then at some point, we're pulled off the field. And it's a huge shift. And for me, this has been, I'm definitely still find this challenging. I'm a CEO, and my job is really different than it was 10 years ago.
Right.
But I'm really good at certain things, and I've been promoted for those certain things, and I have competencies that feel good to me, and patterns that were really good for me 10 years ago, but they're not now. So I think that and in Blair, I'm sure in your company you see this all the time, that as you move into more managerial responsibility, your job becomes less and less about the things that you're expert in, and more about people. Now, what our research shows is, looking at thousands, tens of thousands of people in 126 countries, actually there is a correlation between emotional intelligence and career progression. And so, contrary to how some senior leaders behave, generally speaking, what we see is that in a more senior leadership role, people have higher levels of emotional intelligence, particularly in certain competencies. And I think that that makes sense, because as our sphere of concern expands and our life experience is teaching us, I have to learn how to move these different chess pieces in different ways. It brings us.
Yeah.
But couldn't we get that training a little faster?
Exactly. Yeah. It makes me think, going back to your role as an educator, right back in the day, a teacher, in a previous session, Brittney and I talked with some folks in education about this. We need to be teaching it sooner. And we need to be teaching self-awareness and the role that it plays as an investment in your future, not as a class you have to take because it's outside of the Common Core. If it's not math, science, or English, and all those are very important. I mean, to string a sentence together is important. Being able to do math is important. Understanding how science functions in the world and nature, I get it. But isn't this as equally as important, given the dramatic connection it plays to how people accelerate their careers? And beyond that, right, how you deal with your family and your friends and your neighbors and your homeowners association, and when your neighbor's yard doesn't look the way you want it to, and you feel bad about it because it's impacting your property values. And anyway, sorry.
We do a study called Workplace Vitality Report. And we've been doing this since 2006. And every couple of years, we do a survey. And one of the questions on that survey are, what are the top 2 to 3 issues in your organization? And then what percentage of those would you say are on the people side versus the technical side? And would you care to guess?
Oh, I would bet you almost all of them are.
Yeah, about 70% on the people side.
Yeah.
And it's a lot about influence and culture and connectedness and alignment of people.
So how do you think, Brittney, I'd love your take on this too. How do you make this practical? How do you make this, as we got back to it before, how does it become, what are the steps we can take, right? If the 3 of us had that magic wand I spoke about before, how do we create this? How does it become the fabric of an organization? How does this become the foundational elements for a company, for an organization, a group, a cohort, whatever that thing is? How do we make it so it becomes the foundation by which we go forward?
Yeah, so I'm working on this in this new program I'm creating around the book, which is eliminating the EQ deficit in your organization. And I think first we have to break things down before we can build things up.
Yep.
Because if we have a faulty foundation, we can try to decorate it all we want to, but it's not going to last. And I think that's so important and valuable for leaders and organizations to understand, because it seems that everybody wants a quick fix these days. And with technology giving us more and more quick fixes or easy access to things, it becomes what we expect. And that's what we want to see as the norm. And when you tell someone, well, this is going to be a process, say, well, how long is that going to take? I got a couple hours. And it's like, no, you have to embody this. This is a process. And that's what I talk about in the book is everybody wants a quick fix, but to get real results, we have to, one, start from the beginning. We have to break away old habits. And then we have to really start to be uncomfortable with what is and start to have that humility to identify what is happening now that is hindering us from getting to where we want to go. And if people aren't willing to do that, I don't think they can move forward to start applying all of these other skill sets. Wow. I'd love to hear what Josh has to say, about where to go from there, but ultimately that's where we have to start.
Well, there's so many things came to mind as you were talking. One thing is we did some research on how long it takes to really integrate emotional intelligence.
Okay.
And, it's like 4 years.
Is it? Wow.
So,
and so give me the high level. Why? Why 4 years?
Well, it's because it's easy to start. Okay. As I said, we have a lot of case studies that involve 2 days of training and maybe a little coaching, and we see like a 12 to 15% increase in emotional intelligence in just that. And that is tremendous. Like the difference that makes is phenomenal. One of my favorite research studies, unfortunately we don't have this on our website right now. I have to try to get this on there, but Sue McNamara, who leads 6 Seconds in Asia Pacific, did research with parents, and she also did research with teachers, and the effect of the adults practicing EQ on the kids. No direct training to the kids, and no surprise, right? Tremendous difference.
Yeah.
Sure.
But reading the parents' journals, it was such a beautiful and visceral, like, wow, what a difference 10% increase in EQ makes. You go from the kind of normal transactional, like, why didn't you do your homework, fighting about nonsense, to like, oh, let's actually solve problems and work together. So it's really significant.
Right.
But that is not the same as what you're talking about, really making this part of our culture and our work.
Yeah.
And I think part of the challenge of emotional intelligence is the ubiquity. Every single interaction, every relationship.
Wow.
We're talking about thousands and thousands of interactions.
So the discipline, right?
Mm-hmm.
To really look at it at a systemic level. And so we look at 3 levels. One is the individual, what's going on inside me. The second is the relational, and each of these different relationships that I have as a person or as a leader or somebody in an organization. And then the organizational, and look at our culture and our systems and our structures, and how do we hire, how do we promote, how do we give feedback, what are our norms? Those 3 levels are all measurable.
Wow.
And at all 3 of those levels, there is work and learning and implementation we can do. But that's, that adds up to a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I mean, the organizations, we have several case studies about organizations that have worked on this for multiple years. And the impact is tremendous on retention, on customer service, on sales, on bottom line performance. So, as Brittney-Nichole said, if you're looking for a quick fix, I mean, sure, you can get a little benefit from, a quick emotional intelligence training. But if you actually want to create something different where you're really making this part of your culture, it's going to take a significant commitment, but but it will make a tremendous difference.
Sure, for sure. And my guess would be it's going to be exponential, right? If you could have a role model or a lightning rod for this inside your organization or your group, and they inspire others, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years later, you now have 15 people who have seen how you've done that. And then they're 2 or 3 years later, those 15 are 40 people. And that's really, right, so to your point, the 10% is just 10% statistically, numerically, but it's really way bigger than that because it has so much more meaning across the organization.
Really connected with your work, Brian, we just published a case study at UCB Pharma in Italy. And, this is exactly what you're talking about. They worked with the managers of this, they're not exactly sales, it's sort of like field reps who work with doctors' offices, but they have a sales function. But they worked with their managers.
Got it.
And just like in Sue McNamara's study with parents, when they work with the managers, the employees, these field agents changed the way they were interacting with the customers, with the physicians and nurses and professionals in the field. And that change of relationship created more trust and more connection and a better understanding of what those providers needed from the pharma company. So, I mean, this, as I say, like we can measure that ripple effect, and that's
you can see it. Yeah, it's great. And what's nice too about the way you describe it, right? The data points that you can measure, and actually statistically from a study, you can see the impact on revenue and on sales and on performance reviews and on what people think of their company. But it's that emotional, dare I use the word emotional, it's that emotional component to that actually will leave the long-lasting mark on the company, right? That'll be the thing that changes it. I like to embrace this idea that it might be easier to rule or lead out of fear, because you can say you didn't get it done, you didn't do this, here's how it's supposed to happen. You've been penalized to some degree. You're not getting a merit increase. You're not getting a bonus, whatever the case may be. But wouldn't it be better if the people that were part of your team didn't want to let you down? They didn't want to. They wanted to be successful because they didn't want to let you down. What a much more powerful and meaningful leadership style than coming with a stick to say we've got to sell 5% more. We've got to move 3% more.
I think we can take that up one level higher even, which is we're doing something that's important, and this is my work to do that important thing. And I don't know how others are experiencing this right now, but in the pandemic, as a leader, I have never felt this uncertain. I have never worked this hard. I've never been I'd like to go to my board and say, no, I have no idea what our budget is. I mean, that is a horrible feeling.
Oh, right.
And to have, employees saying, like, what do you think is going to happen? Do I need to worry about my, my pay? And having to say, I don't know. But what I've experienced in this time is just a tremendous sense of this is our organization. This is our work. And I've had so many conversations with team members who've said, I want to know what I can do this better.
Yeah, see, that's powerful.
Yeah.
That's great.
I mean, it brings tears to my eyes because I've known this as a leader. I've known that leadership is about shared ownership, but I've never felt it as viscerally as in the last 6 months.
Amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
And
Yeah.
I think too, like you were saying, Josh, emotions shine in the darkest times, and that could be for the good or for the bad, right? It's if you're in this relationship, things are easy, then you don't notice much of a difference. But it's when that relationship gets hard, that you start to see like how stable people really are with their emotions, because they're either going to really be there for you in your corner, or they're checking out. Right.
Brittney-Nichole, I'm curious about what your sense is about generational differences on this. I've seen we have some data, but I'm curious in your in your conversations with people who are a little older and a little younger, what's the different responses about this concept of emotional intelligence?
Are you asking me or Blair?
Yeah, you.
I was asking
Okay.
you.
So I don't know. I've spoken with a lot of people that are, is it Gen X, that's right below baby boomer?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So Gen X baby boomers who are actually fairly open to it when I explain it. And then there's people my age who don't really know what emotional intelligence is. Some do. It's kind of a mix. I don't have the data there, so I don't want to say, oh, well, this is how it is, because I really don't know. I get, different feedback from different people. I have some people that are older people who are very receptive to it, and I have some people that aren't. But I think that a lot of older generations feel that they are more emotionally intelligent than younger generations, because they had that face-to-face interaction. Life was much slower. They didn't have all the distractions in life, where younger generations, it seems to be more disconnected. In my personal opinion and from observations, I don't think that older generations are necessarily more emotionally intelligent. I think they're more well-behaved and they understand how to be polite. But as I write in my book, being polite does not equal emotional intelligence.
Right.
So that's my opinion on the matter. I think they're more polite and know the right things to say, but don't necessarily, because they gossip more. I feel like the older generations, like I'll always be around them and they're like, do you know what Betty Sue and John were doing? So
I notice my mom is always wanting me to tell her about my kids, and I'm like, talk to them yourself.
Talk to them, exactly. Right, give them a call. Right, especially nowadays. Yeah. What is your take on it, Josh, on the generational impact?
Well, we did some research on it. We published something called State of the Heart. So we have two big research studies that we do. One I mentioned before is the organizational vitality,
right?
State of the Heart, and with the pandemic, we're delaying State of the Heart until next year. But we've started looking at this year's data. What we find is there's not a lot of correlation between emotional intelligence and age. In our model, we have 3 parts, basically being aware, being intentional, being purposeful. That third part is a little more correlated with age, just a tiny bit correlated with age. And again, it kind of makes sense. Like as you get older, again, that's enlarged sphere of concern. You have more people that you know, you have grandkids or whatever.
Yeah.
The middle part, being more intentional, responding instead of reacting, zero correlation with age.
Wow.
But at the same time, I've noticed, and it just may be who I've been hanging out with, but when I started doing this work, I'd get on an airplane and, somebody would say, what do you do? And I'd say, I teach emotional intelligence. And they'd say, emotional what?
Yeah, right, exactly. Exactly. I want to be a therapist. Get away from me. Yeah.
And now, what I find is people under, I don't know, 35, something like that. When I say I teach emotional intelligence, they say, "Oh, that's so needed now."
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that's not statistical data.
Right. It's anecdotal, but yeah, but it's meaningful, right? It's directional. Yeah. It's funny because, with something like this, you get instant, the algorithms are designed to not only align you to people that think the way that you do, but you think the way that you do and you have instant gratification for your thoughts. I think this, and I now go on Twitter, and everyone I follow because of the algorithm thinks the way I do. So it's validated and you move on. And so I think what happens there is the generations that didn't grow up with that, actually maybe have a little bit more of that perspective to say, wait, they have history on their side too, quite frankly. They have a longer history they can recall. Seminal moments in the United States history for that matter. But, you think about how do those moments now, when they would be as important in today's generation, they don't see it through one or two lenses and talk to their friends and neighbors. There's 89 million ways you can find out what's happening, and all of it is filtered based on how you think. It's pre-filtered for you. So it's a very interesting thing that perhaps the generation behind me, at least, maybe more like Brittney's generation, right? It's filtered, it's curated, it comes at you that way. Whereas maybe we and Josh, we got a little bit more from friends and neighbors and family, and we talked more around the table. I mean, pandemic notwithstanding, we were together more and talked it out more maybe than perhaps how folks get data today, which is just through this curated, filtered methodology. You search for these 7 things on Google, so the next time you go back on Google, those are the 7 types of news stories you see. Yeah. You like this show on Netflix, you like this sports team, you like this maker of shoes. Guess what? You're going to see the sports team, the shoes, and the what you follow.
So I have 2 quick thoughts about that. One is, this is, I think, driving for a lot of people a need to learn some different skills. And there's clearly a massive growing, I would say, pandemic of anxiety and depression. And there's a lot of data to suggest that social media is a contributor to that.
Yeah.
And it's connected with your value being outside of you, and you notice that on social media sites, they call it reactions, right? How many reactions did you get? And, I know Brittney-Nichole and I are both really wanting people to react less and respond more.
Right.
But I think that that's a driving force for a lot of people saying, wow, we have to learn more about this.
Yeah.
The other thing, just as, again, not a big data point, but both my 19-year-old and 21-year-old are rejecting use of their phones. And it's kind of hard to get in touch with them sometimes because they're like, oh yeah, I just don't like checking my phone all the time. So
they're more passive. It's a more passive use, which is fascinating, right? And so
my 19-year-old, I was trying to reach him, and a couple days later, he's like, "Oh, sorry, I've just been leaving my phone in my dorm room because I don't want to carry it around with me all the time."
Right. Amazing.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, amazing.
So I think we may be. One of my younger colleagues at 6 Seconds, we were talking about, well, should we make an app or not? He said, oh, no, we shouldn't make an app. App use is declining dramatically.
Amazing. Yeah, I saw a very interesting study. It's now probably a couple of years old, but I vividly remember the chart. It was the first versions of cell phones and the number of phone calls that were made. And so it was the first cell phone, was here, and the phone calls are here. And then as the cell phones evolve, phone calls go down and cell phones become more of a fancy camera and an app holding tool with an occasional phone call.
I don't make calls anymore.
Right. It's amazing, right? It's amazing how it was a phone and we still call it a phone, but it's really not used to make phone calls.
That's true.
Right? It's really fascinating.
Well, I think it's a good metaphor of, like Brittney-Nichole, you talked about this in the beginning. Emotions are data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this data is messages from us to us and from us to each other.
Yep.
And just, are we going to look through a screen at the world? Or are we going to actually start getting that data, listening to ourselves and to each other?
Yeah, that's great.
It's almost like hieroglyphics, it's only a few people can actually read it. And then everybody else just interprets it however they want to. And then you have a mess. You just have a mess. So we just all need to be able to correctly understand the message, because we'll mislabel things all the time. I'm angry because of this person. No, you're angry for some other reason, whether it's the need to be heard and you feel like you're not being heard. That's the source of that anger. But instead you pin it on that person or that situation. And if you pin it on that person, that situation, then you're simply the victim and you have no control over it, versus this is the unmet need behind that emotion, and here's how I can address it and communicate that so that need is met.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think, I know we're coming close to time here, so that's a nice way to kind of put a bow of it on our conversation. Josh, what do you think about the future for us? 5 years, 10 years down the road, what are we facing? What can we do? What are some actions we can take now? What are some things we should be thinking about for the future?
Well, I think that we're at an inflection point in human history. And my hope is, that we come out of this pandemic and we come out of the era that we're in, and we say it's time for us to take ownership of our own lives, take ownership of building healthy communities and healthy relationships. My fear is that we continue down this road of blame and polarization. And probably we're going to do both, some of each. But for myself, what I want in my own life is to be able to look in the mirror at the end of the day and say, I'm doing my part to make the world a better place.
It's great.
And, I think we have access to a ton of tools to help us do that. And it's time for us to learn this language and learn about ourselves and learn about each other and really figure out how we work and use that.
And be open to it. It's great.
Speaking of tools, I'm telling you, 6 seconds is a phenomenal no, seriously. I mean, you have everything I can think of that you would need to develop your emotional intelligence. 6 seconds has that. And you can get training too, through you guys. So it goes all the way from children all the way up to corporate. And like you were saying earlier, you help anyone and everyone that needs or is interested in developing their emotional intelligence. So I will put all that information in the show notes, because
nice. I love it.
It's a tremendous resource.
I love it. Well, thank you guys both. For the time today. This was really
thank you.
Insightful.
Thank you so much,
and I
Josh.
think my hope is folks watching would feel the same way and have comments and questions and want to participate. And so we'll be sure to get you anything that's extenuating, Josh, so that you can help us answer and help move it forward. And for anybody interested, we'll have another session this time next week, session 4 of our book tour, which I love. and it was great.
And I just wanted to say congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I know that feeling of like holding the book in your hands and going, wow.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, I'll be sure to send you a copy. So
thank you.
I'll get your address after this. But thank you, Josh. Thank you, Blair, again for moderating. It's been an honor to have you both on. So
thank you.
All right, everyone. Till next time, take care.
Yep, take care. We'll see you.
Bye.